Chapter 14 Fairy Tim Plays Some Tricks. Mr. Denning knew a great deal about Egypt. In fact, if he had not been a minister, he would have been an archaeologist, for he knew so much, and read so much, and cared so much about everything Egyptian. So now that a new tomb had been uncovered way off in far Egypt, he was invited to go to a city 50 miles away and give a lecture about Egyptian kings. He rose early that morning so that he might give his lecture a little final polishing and be in good time for his train. But from the first getting out of bed, everything, instead of going smoothly, as Mr. Denning had hoped it would, went roughly and zigzag and roundabout. In fact, nothing went right, and it was all Fairy Tim's fault. The children knew that from the very beginning. But what was the matter with Fairy Tim? He was always full of fun, and merry of course, but he had never been downright mischievous before. It all began while the parsonage family was dressing. Robin had just got to his shoelacings when Fairy Tim came running into the room, dressed today in a blue suit. His daylight cape was unclasped and flying from one shoulder carelessly. He was laughing. In his hand he carried something that caught the morning sunlight and glinted. When he reached the middle of the room, he twirled around on his heels several times and then threw down the little shining object. It rolled along the floor, straight toward the register. There it tumbled through the grating, and was lost down the pipe. "What was that?" Robin asked, for Fairy Tim seemed to think he had done something quite clever. "Your father's collar button," he answered. "He'll never find it there." "Why, Fairy Tim!" Robin looked amazed. He wanted to cry out, "How naughty!" but he did not quite dare speak so to a fairy missionary, for little as Fairy Tim was, and merry as he was, the children had plenty of respect for him. So Robin now only stared. In a minute he heard his father's voice. "Where's my collar button? I'm sure I laid it here on the table a minute ago. What's become of it?" Mother Denning hurried from the nursery, where she had been dressing baby Paul, to help in the search, but after some time she gave it up. Now when Mother Denning could not find a lost object, it meant that that object was lost indeed. No use for any more hunting. Father Denning was, of course, much bothered. This had been his best collar button, the one that went in the easiest and held the best. No help for it, though. He must find another in his collar box. At first, Robin wanted to tell his father that the lost collar button was down the register. But Robin was a thoughtful boy, and because of this he saw that telling on Fairy Tim could do no good. The collar button could not be rescued from the register, and Father Denning would surely blame Fairy Tim and call him a bad fairy. Robin did not want Fairy Tim blamed. Well, breakfast was 15 minutes late, because of the lost collar button. After breakfast, Father Denning hurried into his study to look over his lecture and polish it. Beth and Robin had gone to dig in their garden, just under the study windows. They heard a sudden rustling and looked up, and there was Fairy Tim dancing along the window sill, a sheet of their father's writing in his hand. In a second he had jumped into the snowdrop bush, and from there to the ground. Away around the corner of the house he whisked, the sheet of paper flying after him like a banner. In a minute, through the study window, the children heard their father's voice. It sounded very troubled indeed. "Page 4 of my lecture is missing," he called to Mother Denning, who was now in the kitchen. "It was lying right here on my desk, with the rest of them, and now it's certainly gone." Mother Denning came hurrying from the kitchen. "It must have blown out the window," the children heard her say sensibly. "You ought to keep a paper weight on your papers." "It did not blow out the window," Robin called. "We just saw it blowing." Beth was amazed. "Why, Robin Denning," she began, but Robin stopped her. "What's the use?" he whispered quickly. "Fairy Tim's no more than the wind to them. They can't see him." Father and Mother Denning both came hurrying out of the side door. With the children they searched everywhere, all about the house, in among the bushes and shrubbery, and even went into the field to hunt. But no sheet of paper with Father Denning's writing on it could they find, and all this time he had meant to be polishing the lecture. Beth and Robin were deeply troubled. How could their dear Fairy Tim be so very naughty? "You will have to write page 4 over, I am afraid," Mother Denning said at last. "Can't you remember how it went?" "Well, I shall have to try," Father Denning agreed. He was much bothered, and not half an hour before train time. Mother Denning went back to the kitchen, and the children, whispering to each other, returned to their digging. But Robin, after a minute, happened to straighten up to stretch his back, and just as he did so, he saw Fairy Tim, ever so softly, run up the side of the snowdrop bush, and jump right over the sill into the study window. What should Robin do about it? Fairy Tim had been smiling, still pleased with himself. Robin could see easily enough that he was still bent on mischief. But Robin dared not go into his father's study to warn him against Fairy Tim, for Mother Denning had made a very strict rule that when their father was working, the children were never to go into the study, or speak to him, or disturb him in any way. Robin whispered to Beth what he had just seen. She was as anxious as he, but she agreed that there was nothing they could do about it. The children scarcely had the heart to dig any more. Still, they could not go away and leave the spot. They wanted to be there, if Fairy Tim should come out, to argue with him and scold him for his naughty tricks. For yes, even if he was a fairy missionary, the children were determined now to tell him he was a naughty fairy. They sat in the grass by the side of the garden, and made dandelion curls. That is a very good way to pass the time when one is uneasy. At last they heard Mother Denning call from her bedroom, where she was sitting by the window with her work basket. "Aren't you going to be late for the train, Father? I haven't my watch up here, but it must be very near time." Father Denning's reply came as though he were deep in thought, and he answered almost without knowing he answered. "It's all right. Don't bother. I'm watching the time." Beth had made 10 silvery dandelion curls and stuck them over her ears, and Robin had just finished his 6th, for he was slower about such things than Beth. When Father Denning finally came out of the house with his hat in his hand, his light overcoat over his arm, and the pages of his lecture sticking from his pocket, Mother Denning had hurried down the stairs, and now they stood arm in arm on the porch. "I'll be home tomorrow on the 9 o'clock, he assured her. "Oh, may we walk with you to the station?" asked the children, running up. Father Denning said that he would be very glad to have them. So waving goodbye to Mother, they started off across the fields, on a short cut to the station. But when Father Denning had waved his hat to Mother Denning, just before putting it on, Fairy Tim had jumped out of it. The children, in spite of their disapproval of his morning's behavior, could not help laughing at that. How cunning of him to be hiding in Father's hat! Oh, how they wished their father had fairy-seeing eyes! They had scarcely taken a dozen steps in the field, however, before they heard a shrill whistle. Why, that was surely the train. The train always whistled just like that at the crossing, about 1 minute from the station. Father would never be in time now. No use to run. Father Denning stood stock still, looking amazed indeed. "Why, this simply can't be," he cried. "I don't understand." But the children looked at Fairy Tim. He was dancing all around them, laughing. "It's true, true," he cried in his fairy voice, which the minister could not hear. "True, true. He's lost his train." Father Denning pulled out his watch, and with it, from his watch pocket, came Fairy Tim's little yellow tam-o'-shanter. Ho, ho! Fairy Tim had left his tam-o'-shanter in Father Denning's watch pocket. So Fairy Tim must have been in that watch pocket himself. The children began to understand. The tam-o'-shanter fluttered to the grass, and Fairy Tim snatched it up and put it jauntily on his head. Father Denning looked long at the face of his watch. "Yes, it's 9:30, he muttered to himself. "My watch is all right. I must have looked at it wrong, that is all, while I was working." Of course, Father Denning did not know that a fairy had been in his pocket. Who could hope to tell the time of day right with a fairy fooling around in his watch pocket? How Fairy Tim had managed to make their father look at his watch wrong, the children could not guess, but they were sure he had had everything to do with it. Naughty, bad, naughty Fairy Tim," Robin cried out now, not caring a bit that his father should hear. But Fairy Tim was away, skipping over the fields, laughing back at Robin. Robin dashed after him, not knowing exactly what he would do with him when he caught him, but well meaning to do something. Beth stayed back a minute with her disappointed father. "I'm so sorry," she said, squeezing his hand. Father Denning smiled down at her, but his smile was a wry one. "No help for it," he said. "Egypt will have to get along without me today." Mother Denning, of course, had heard the train whistle too. Now she came across the field to meet her husband and comfort him with sensible words. Then Beth heard Robin shout. He had almost caught Fairy Tim. Away she sped to join in the chase, while Mother and Father walked slowly back to the house. And Fairy Tim led the children a very long chase indeed. Through the fields and meadows he ran, always just a tiny bit ahead of them. Sometimes he ducked down into long grass until they had gone by, only to jump out at their heels, waving the yellow tam-o'-shanter and shouting teasingly. At last they lost him altogether, but they did not care much. They had almost forgotten to be cross with him. It was such a lovely day in the meadows, yellow with buttercups, cowslips, and black-eyed Susans. They sat down finally between the roots of a willow tree, and there Fairy Tim came to them, out of the sunshine it seemed, and perched, all unafraid, on Beth's knee. "This is the way to catch a fairy," he told them, sitting quietly, "just as you are now. You might run all day and never catch one, but sit still like this, and they can hardly escape you." This was sound fairy teaching. The children had to laugh at him, in spite of their disapproval, but they asked, "Why, oh why, were you so very naughty this morning, Fairy Tim?" "It was mean to make father lose his train." "Are you quite sure it was mean?" Fairy Tim asked. "Why, of course we're sure," cried Beth. "It was mean, and it was naughty. I thought you were a missionary. A funny missionary to behave like that." Robin, however, who was always more thoughtful, said, "We're almost sure, Fairy Tim. It seemed naughty. Perhaps you can explain." But Fairy Tim had sprung away from them, and was now up on the first limb of the willow. He shaded his eyes with his hand. "There's Dr. James jogging along behind old Lincoln," he cried. "Dr. James will be better at explaining than a fairy. Explaining's a game for a human to play." "Dr. James," sniffed Beth. "I'd like to know what he knows about it." But she was glad that Dr. James was coming, for he was one of her very best friends. Old Lincoln took his time, however, and it was several minutes before Dr. James, in his buggy, got to the bend in the road where the children sat under the old willow at the edge of the meadows. He drew his rein the minute he saw them. "Well, on my word, the parsonage children. And what are you doing way off here, so far from home, and long past dinner time. Past dinner time? Why, we thought it was just the middle of the morning. You thought wrong then. It's a good bit past 1, and your dinner's getting cold. I know, for I've just come from your house, and I heard your mother wondering what had become of you. Oh, Fairy Tim, you have upset things today. Beth could not help scolding as she turned upon their fairy friend. Just everything's going wrong. Dr. James was much surprised to hear Beth saying that. Everything's gone right, you mean? He contradicted her. How can you say everything's wrong when you've a dear little new baby sister at home, just waiting there for you to come and say hello to her? Beth and Robin stood round-eyed silent. They stood so silent that they heard the bees in the meadow buzzing and the brook flowing. Then they whispered, a baby sister at our house, now. But there was truly no need for their questioning, for well they knew that old Dr. James was a truth speaker. Yes, he said, and you off skylarking here in the meadows all morning, with never a word for her, and saying everything's gone wrong with this day. Beth and Robin began to jump up and down and clap their hands. A sister, a new sister, they sang. A sister, a baby sister. And then, suddenly forgetting all the manners their mother had ever taught them, they whisked about and dashed away over the fields toward home, with never a good-bye to kind old Dr. James. But he did not mind that a bit. He understood. Father Denning saw them coming, while they were still far out on the meadows. He went to meet them, but he saw at once by their shining faces that someone had told them about their new baby sister. And think, he exclaimed, as he turned and walked toward the parsonage with them, one holding to either hand. Think, today was to be her birthday, and I never guessed. Pretty lucky I did miss that train. Why, I wouldn't have been way off there in the city and not here to welcome her. No, not for all the Egyptian kings of history. Robin looked up at his father. It seems as though a fairy must have had a hand in your losing that collar button and missing your train and all, he suggested. Well, if it was a fairy, Father Denning said, laughing happily, it was a good fairy. Perhaps it was your Fairy Tim. Beth and Robin laughed out loud at that, but they had no time to explain to their father how it had really been Fairy Tim, for they had come to the gate, and the parsonage door stood open. They let go of their father's hand, and ran, just as fast as ever they could, up the walk. But when they came to the steps they stopped, and trod softly. For no matter how rejoiced one may be, one always does go softly, somehow, to greet a new baby. Beth and Robin went so softly that they heard Fairy Tim singing a new song as he stepped along up the stairs beside them. Be chary, be wary, how you blame a fairy, for spider webs of mischief, with tricks and dodges spun, for wisdom's in attending until you see the ending, and know for sure 'tis mischief, and not a service done. Chapter 15. Mary Nelson says Fairy Tim must go. Whenever a new baby comes, there is a little more work to be done in a house. So, for a few weeks, Miss Denning had to have help. A woman came out that very day from the city. She was a trained nurse, and her name was Mary Nielsen. She dressed in a starched blue and white dress, and wore a white cap and a white apron. She was partly Scotch and partly Irish, and that is where all the trouble began, for trouble did begin just at once, in spite of all the happiness of having a new baby at the parsonage. The Scotch part of Mary Nielsen was sensible. It did not believe in fairies, but the Irish part of her was sensible in quite another way, and did believe in fairies. So, the very first night at supper, the Irish part of Mary Nielsen spied Fairy Tim sitting on the rim of Robin's glass, sipping the fresh warm milk. Fairy Tim had pushed his daylight cape away from his shoulders so that it would not get wet in the milk, and that is how he came out so plainly to the view of Mary Nielsen. He was in a golden yellow suit too, the suit he had got for himself by working so hard to make Father Denning miss his train. So he was all the more conspicuous. "Why, Robin," Mary Nielsen asked, in surprise, "what is that drinking from your glass?" "That's Fairy Tim," Beth and Robin and baby Paul cried out, all in a breath. They were delighted that Mary Nielsen should be a fairy-seeing person, but Fairy Tim was not exactly delighted. He knew about the Scotch in Mary Nielsen. In a flash, he drew his daylight cape closely about him. Then he was invisible to all but the very keenest of fairy-seeing eyes. Mary Nielsen frowned. She was cross because she had not looked more carefully before she spoke. Of course there could not be a fairy on the rim of Robin's glass. Her eyes had played her a trick. That is what she thought, and Fairy Tim, being wise, let her think so. But in spite of all his carefulness, the next day Mary Nielsen did keep catching glimpses of Fairy Tim. Once she caught him dancing on the foot of the new baby's bassinet, his daylight cape flying out from him like butterfly wings as he danced. She was afraid he would wake the baby, but there was no danger of that. He was no noisier than a sunbeam. In spite of his leaps and somersaults and dancing. The minute Mary Nielsen saw him and frowned, he stopped still as still. Then, in a flash, he wrapped his daylight cape round and round him, and held a corner of it between his face and her annoyed eyes. He was invisible to her then, and so she did not see him turn and make a long leap to the window sill, and go hand over hand down the vine that grew there. Fairy Tim hated going away so, and leaving the new baby, for he liked playing near her, even when she was asleep. But he did not trust Mary Nielsen, and he was right in that. However, the next glimpse of Fairy Tim that Mary Nielsen caught made her laugh outright before she remembered to frown. He was sailing about merrily on the baby's sponge in her little tin bathtub. The new baby was lying sidewise in Mary Nielsen's lap, having her back powdered. Now babies, only a day old, are not supposed to notice things, and it is certainly true that they do not notice just ordinary things. But it is sure that they notice fairies. So the new baby was noticing Fairy Tim sailing around on the sponge, and she was laughing at him. Mary Nielsen could not hear her laugh, it is true, but the Irish part of her knew that she must be laughing. That was when Mary Nielsen frowned. Babies a day old should never have so much excitement as this, she thought. They shouldn't notice things. It's not good for them. But just then the new baby stopped laughing, for Mary Nielsen's frown had driven Fairy Tim right away. All this was very annoying, Mary Nielsen said to herself. A fairy drinking from Robin's glass. Anyone could see that was unsanitary. Besides, Robin should be made to drink his own milk, whether he liked it or not. A fairy jumping around on the foot of a baby's bed when that baby was asleep and ought to stay asleep was dangerous. And a baby, just a day old, made to take notice and laugh just because a fairy went floating around in her bath. That was a shame. But the thing that really made Mary Nielsen decide that Fairy Tim must be sent away out of the parsonage happened that evening. The new baby had been put into her soft, sweet night things and folded away for a nap in her pink and white bassinet. Then Mary Nielsen had gone down to have supper with the parsonage family. When supper was finished, Mary Nielsen said to herself, "I'll have time for a bit of a walk around the village before the baby's next feeding time. But first I had better steal upstairs and see that she is sleeping quietly." And it was because Mary Nielsen went stealing up the stairs that she saw the fairies. Troops and troops and troops of them, all Fairy Tim's friends, in fact, were running up the stairs ahead of her. The new baby's door had been left open a crack, and in through this crack the fairies were pouring. Mary Nielsen stood stock still in the middle of the stairs to get her breath. She had never been so surprised in her life, and as she stood, troops of fairies hurried past her, brushing against her starched skirt until it rustled. They were all hurrying on up to the party in the new baby's room. How did they dare? How dared they? And the baby asleep? Out through the crack of the door came sounds of light music, fairy laughter, bells, tinkling, tinkling, tinkling. Then laughter that was not fairy laughter. It was one-day-old baby laughter. Mary Nielsen could stand no more of such doings. She had been trained carefully in a hospital, and surely knew what was good and what was not good for newborn babies. Up the remaining stairs she ran, and flung open the door. The room was full of them. They were dancing over everything. A ring of them were even dancing over the new baby, and the new baby was lying there, her dark blue eyes, that should have been closed down in sweet sleep, wide, very wide open. But a second after Mary Nielsen had flung open the door, the dancing stopped, the music stopped. The fairies whisked their daylight wraps about them and rushed away, invisible, into the summer evening. Only Fairy Tim was left behind. In his great haste, he had caught a foot in the lace of the baby's white coverlet. He lay now right across her little chest, sprawling and plain to Mary Nielsen's view. She reached a hand for him, but Fairy Tim was too quick for that. He got away just in time. Mary Nielsen, very cross indeed, tucked the baby carefully in, but no tucking really was needed. Not a fairy there would have let the baby get untucked. Then Mary Nielsen went determinedly down to Father Denning's study. Beth and Robin were playing a game of parcheesi on the sofa, but Mary Nielsen acted as though they were not there. Fairy Tim must go, she said to Father Denning. Why? Asked Father Denning, much surprised at that. I never knew him to do any harm. In fact, I've never even seen him. Have you? I should say I have seen him. He's always bobbing up. He disturbs the baby and won't let her sleep. A new little baby should have utter peace and quiet. We are taught that at the hospital. And what does Fairy Tim do? He fills her room with music and commotion. She is made to notice things. A new baby should never notice things. No, if I stay here, Mr. Denning, Fairy Tim must go. Father Denning was made very sorry by Mary Nielsen's words. It seems a great pity to me, he said. The children have had such a good time with him, but of course the new baby must have her sleep. Nothing is more important than that right now. I know that myself, nurse, without a hospital training. And Beth and Robin are sensible enough to know that, too. They are good children. Tomorrow, they must say goodbye to their fairy friend and ask him politely to go. Imagine how Beth and Robin felt, but their grief and dismay were too great for them to find words of protest. Besides, Mary Nielsen went on now, there are other things that make Fairy Tim a nuisance here. Robin should drink his own milk. Growing children need milk. Oh, but Robin does drink his milk, Father Denning assured her. He is very good about it lately. Why, just tonight I noticed that every drop of it was gone. Yes, it was gone all right, but it was into Fairy Tim it went, and not into Robin. At least a third of it anyway, I saw. To be sure. I had forgotten, Father Denning exclaimed. I remember Miss Denning telling Robin some weeks ago that he might share with Fairy Tim, so that's all right. I beg your pardon, but that's not all right. I am a nurse, and I am in charge of the children for this while. I shall want Robin to drink all his own milk. Very well, agreed Father Denning. Of course you do know all about these things, and I suppose that, since you say so, Fairy Tim must go. But it's a pity, just the same." As he was speaking, the clock on the bookcase struck 7. Mary Nielsen jumped right up in the middle of Father Denning's sentences, in great dismay. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear!" she exclaimed. "It's much later than I thought, and I've forgotten that blessed darling's mealtime. How could I ever be so careless? She must be crying her poor little heart out. Oh, the lamb! Oh, the poor dear!" With her starched skirts crackling, Mary Nielsen fled right away out of the study. It was funny to see her so upset and hurrying. She was usually so sedate a person. But Mary Nielsen did not hear the new baby crying when she reached the top of the stairs. Not a bit of it. All was still in the room, still as still, and so tranquil. Mary Nielsen tiptoed over to the pink and white bassinet. The baby was fast asleep, her tiny round arms flung straight up over her head, the tiny pink hands curled, and right beside her head, on the cool flat pillow, lay Fairy Tim, fast asleep too. It was dusk in the room, and Mary Nielsen saw his daylight cape shining. She stood many seconds looking down at the sleeping fairy and the sleeping baby. At last, instead of the frown that you might have expected, came a smile, a kind, sweet smile to Mary Nielsen's eyes. "What a good fairy it is," she whispered. "Mary Nielsen was naughty to you, baby, for getting your milk so. But Fairy Tim remembered. He didn't let you cry. Did he sing you to sleep? You look as though he had." So that is how it happened that when Mary Nielsen at last got around to her evening walk, the children, sitting sadly on the top piazza step, saw Fairy Tim come riding gaily on her shoulder. "Why, Fairy Tim, how dare you?" they cried, amazed. But Fairy Tim laughed. They had never seen him in a merrier mood. "Come along, Beth and Robin," he cried. "Nurse and I are going for a stroll in the meadows." Nurse Nielsen was stepping lightly, smiling. She held one hand out to Beth, the other to Robin. "Why, we thought you didn't like Fairy Tim," they murmured. "Well, I'll tell you," explained Mary Nielsen. "I didn't, but I do now. I like him very, very much, and I've come to think that perhaps fairies know more about babies than even trained hospital nurses do. I have asked Fairy Tim to teach me a little, so he is going to stay to do that." He's going to stay. He's going to stay. How Beth and Robin skipped and jumped, each holding fast to a hand of Mary Nielsen, and Fairy Tim, up on her starched shoulder, skipped and jumped too, for truly it had been a narrow escape. Chapter 16. 3 Young Fairy Girls. One day, when the baby was about 2 weeks old, Beth and Robin and baby Paul were up in the hill pasture belonging to old Dr. James, walking with Fairy Tim. At the very top of the pasture there are a few mossy stones, looking as though they had been there always, and as though they loved the pasture. Before one of them Fairy Tim stopped in his walking, and the children stopped with him. "This is where some cousins of mine live," he said. "I should rather like to pay them a call." The children looked hard at the stone. It appeared to be just an ordinary gray rock, grown over in spots with soft green moss, with a few shining pebbles lodged in its crevices. "But it's truly my cousin's house," Fairy Tim affirmed, for he saw that the children looked doubtful. "And I should like to call on them. They are nice girls, jolly girls. Will you call with me, or will you go on over the hill? I shall soon overtake you if you want to do that." "Oh, we should like to call with you, please," Beth and Robin almost whispered in their glad suspense. "If you'll only let us, Fairy Tim." Baby Paul danced all round the gray rock in a circle, clapping his chubby hands. "Please, please, please," he sang. "Then you'd better watch out to do as I say," Fairy Tim warned them. "There are difficulties about human children calling on ordinary fairies like my cousins." "Oh, we'll watch out. We'll do what you say." "Lie down here then, flat in a row. I'll lie between Beth and Robin. Baby Paul, take Robin's hand. Now we're ready. Beth, knock on the rock." They were lying in a row, facing the rock. Beth reached out her hand and knocked a little shyly. She knocked just as she would knock on the door to a stranger's house, and the door opened just as the door to a house opens, except that it opened itself, and there was no one standing in it. To tell the truth, I suppose the door didn't really open after all, for houses in fairyland have no doors. They just have doorways. And the same with the windows. They are simply casements without glass in them. What really happened then, when Beth knocked so shyly, was that the house of Fairy Tim's cousins came clear to the children's view. Beth looked straight in through the doorway. Robin and Baby Paul could see, in the same way, into the windows. Such a darling house, and such darling people in it. They were 3 young fairy girls, Tim's cousins. They looked to be about 14 or 15, or perhaps 16 years old, but they were even tinier than Fairy Tim himself. Marlene was the prettiest. She had dark braids over each shoulder, dark, thick, glossy, tiny braids tied with blue ribbon at the ends. Her dress was blue too, peacock blue, and hung straight and full almost to her ankles. On her tiny feet even for a fairy, she wore pretty blue sandals. At the minute, the doorway into the fairy house came plain to the children's view. Marlene was sweeping the floor and tidying the room. The floor of this particular fairy house was made of very small white pebbles, laid in close rows, You might think that the uneven surface of that floor would be hard on the feet of the fairies who lived there, but it was not a bit. I will tell you why. When fairies move about in their own houses, they do not walk, ever. They dance, and they dance so lightly and so gaily that their feet scarcely know the floor at all. Marlene was dancing now as she swept. Such light, pretty dancing. The children gasped to see it. "Hello, Marlene, hello there," called Fairy Tim. At sound of her cousin's voice, Marlene dropped her broom and came running to the doorway. Her rosy little face sparkled with pleasure. "It's our Tim," she called over her shoulder to her sisters, farther back in the room. "Oh, how are you, Tim? Come in, come in." "How are you, Tim?" echoed Lalaine and Florna. Lalaine was perched up on a stool, her feet on the top rung. She was hemming the tiniest kerchief, a lavender kerchief, about the size of a violet petal. Florna was sitting on the floor by a far window, cutting out a new daylight cape that she planned as a surprise present for her cousin Tim. When she heard his voice, she rolled the cape up in a flash and tucked it under her. She was so quick that Fairy Tim never glimpsed it at all. Strange to say, the three fairy girls paid no attention to the human children staring in at their doors and windows. That was because most fairies do not pay much attention to humans who are over a year old. That, however, is all the humans' fault, I should like to have you know. But now, this fairy habit was a good thing for Beth and Robin and baby Paul, because they could look well all about the fairy house and at the pretty fairy girls, without any bother with polite conversation, and they made good use of their eyes. There were so many window casements in this house that the whole place was washed in sunlight, but the moss, dropping a bit over the windows, tinted the sunlight with green. When you look into a pool in a birch wood in June, you see the same color that lay over that fairy room. The three cousins were delighted to have Fairy Tim there calling. They fell upon him with questions. "Are you ever coming back?" they asked. "Is it fun being a missionary? How is that dear new baby? Have they named her yet? Has she sent us any messages?" Then how Beth's and Robin's and baby Paul's eyes grew wide to hear the many and interesting messages their new baby sister had sent by Fairy Tim to his fairy cousins. The fairy cousins clapped their hands. Tell her from us," they said, and then they gave dozens of messages for Fairy Tim to take back to the new baby. And such messages. The only trouble was that they were given in such long words, and were so full of deep fairy meaning, that the listening children hardly understood a one. How their tiny baby sister was to understand, they could not guess. Then the girls began looking Fairy Tim over in a cousinly way, Florna said slyly, sitting all the while hard on the cape she was hiding. "Your daylight cape's getting a bit worn in the world of humans, cousin. There is a tear on the shoulder." "Yes, that's where Nurse Nielsen grabbed at me when I caught my foot in the lace coverlet the other night," Fairy Tim said ruefully. "I could very well do with a new cape. You'd better make me one, Cousin Florna." And all the time he never guessed that she was sitting on a new cape for him. But now Fairy Tim tried tactfully to get his cousin's attention to the callers he had brought them. These children, he said, would like a drink of the clear juice. They can see pretty well now, but that is because I have taught them, and am here to point things out to them. But they are getting nearer, grown up, every day, and it will be much better for their fairy-seeing eyes if they can only have a drink of the clear juice out of your pretty goblets, cousins. Will you be so kind, please?" Now when a human has once drunk fairy clear juice out of a fairy goblet, he will forever after be a fairy seer. Yes, even if he lives to be 100. The children knew that, so they were delighted. Lalaine and Florna and Marlene were always eager to please Fairy Tim, so without a question they jumped to do his wish. At least Lalaine and Marlene jumped. Florna could not get up because of the cape she was hiding, but she sat smiling and nodding her little curly head, showing her hospitality. Lalaine and Marlene danced lightly to a high cupboard in the wall. It was a cunning cupboard, colored on the inside like a seashell. When the doors to it were opened, the children could see rows and rows of tiny jugs, all different colors, but all with crystal stoppers. The two girls, together, lifted down one of these jugs and danced with it to a table. Then, from another cupboard, they brought goblets, one for Robin, one for Beth, and one for baby Paul. They were crystal goblets, with tiny, tiny, tiny forget-me-nots painted on them. The children wondered how they were ever to drink from anything so small. Lalaine and Marlene filled the 3 crystal goblets with clear juice from the jug. Then they placed the goblets on a tray and brought it, dancing, to the door of the house. But though they danced, they did not spill a drop. That was because they danced so lightly. Florna, of course, kept her place on the floor, but all the while she nodded her curly head so pleasantly that the children felt she was offering them the drink as much as her sisters. How strangely it tasted! A burning, chilling taste of bitter-sweet on the tongue. "Now," said Fairy Tim contentedly, "if the time ever comes when fairies are there and you don't see them, it will be just your own fault. That's all." "How I wish the Big Six might drink some of this clear juice," Beth said, sighing. "Then they'd find out how silly and blind they have been, I guess." "Oh, they've all had their chance to drink clear juice," Fairy Tim assured her, or if any of them hasn't, he will have some time. Everybody has a chance somehow before he gets over being a child altogether. If that's true, Fairy Tim, Beth asked sensibly, then why aren't all grown-ups fairy seers? I suppose because, though they've had the chance right enough, they've let it slip, replied Fairy Tim. It's the easiest chance to let slip in the world, I can tell you. Do you think Dick Barnes has had his chance yet? Fairy Tim considered a minute. No, I hardly think he has. He doesn't look to be a fellow to let any chance slip. Oh, how I wish. How I wish, then, I might take him some clear juice, Beth cried, very eager. Robin looked at her surprised, but Fairy Tim was not surprised. I think fairies never are. Nothing's easier, if you have patience, he assured her. If he hasn't had his chance, and I don't think he has, why, you'll be it, you see. Oh, shall I? If you have the patience, I said, the patience to carry a goblet without spilling it all the way back down to the village. Ho, ho, I can surely do that. We shall see. You can certainly try. So Marlene and Lalaine danced away again to the cupboards and filled a fourth tiny goblet with clear juice. They danced with it to Beth. Now, said Fairy Tim, when the children had thanked the cousins for their hospitality, it is time to go. Oh, not without a dance, cried his cousins. You wouldn't go without a dance, surely. No, of course not. Not without a dance, agreed Fairy Tim. For that is what fairies do when they call on one another. They have a dance, just as people in the world have a cup of tea. Marlene and Lalaine held out their hands. Fairy Tim leapt toward them, and together they swung round and round and round over the clean, pebbly white floor. Only Flurna stuck to her place and did not dance. That was unusual and surprised Fairy Tim. But in spite of his surprise, he asked her no questions. It was only good fairy manners to let her do as she pleased and ask no questions. When the dance was done, Fairy Tim, with the children, said goodbye and started down over the hill pasture toward the village. Beth, of course, had to walk very carefully, not to spill her tiny crystal goblet. Indeed, she walked so carefully and so slowly, one foot put down like velvet before the other, that the others did not wait for her, but skipped on ahead. That was surely a test of Beth's patience, but she held out, sensibly, and never hurried or fussed. If she had done either, she never would have got the precious juice safe home without spilling, that is certain. But at last, and not a drop spilled, the puzzle was how to keep the clear juice safe until she could see Dick Barnes and get him to drink it. Mary Nielsen had an idea. Why not put it in your thimble, she said, and seal it over with some paraffin from the pantry. That way you can carry it around in your pocket and give it to Dick at the right minute. You don't want to offer it to him just any old time, of course. Fairy Tim himself says some children never drink the clear juice, even when they get the chance, you know. Well, may that not be because it's offered at the wrong minute, when they are too busy or something. If I were you, I'd just carry it around in my pocket and wait for a good chance. Beth thought this very clever of Mary Nielsen, and indeed it was. So the two together melted some paraffin that Mother said they might have from the pantry supply, and dropped it into the top of Beth's thimble with the clear juice underneath. But the darling crystal goblet, painted with forget-me-nots, Beth stood on a high, safe shelf in her doll's house, and there it sparkled in the dimness like a steady tiny star. Chapter 17. The Big Six Are of Some Use. Day after tomorrow is Robin's birthday, Beth reminded her mother one morning at the breakfast table. Fairy Tim, sitting on the edge of Robin's glass of milk, twinkled expectantly. I think we ought not to ask Dick Barnes and those big boys to my party this year, Robin affirmed. They don't deserve a party. But Miss Denning looked grave. She said, I have hated to tell you children, but there just can't be any party at all this year. You see, there are 6 of us now, not 5, and it is costing quite a bit more, but we'd rather have Marlene than a birthday every day in the year, wouldn't we? Marlene was the name they had given the new baby. Mr. and Mrs. Denning, you see, had let their children name her themselves, after the prettiest of Fairy Tim's fairy cousins. Yes, it was true. Little Marlene was better than many birthday parties. Still, the children looked at one another bewildered. When had they not had a birthday party when there was a birthday? But Robin did not cry or even pout. He was almost 7, remember, and besides, who could cry or pout with a funny little creature like Fairy Tim sitting right on the edge of his glass of milk? By keeping his eyes fixed on Fairy Tim, Robin managed not even to feel sad, and that gladdened his mother. But after breakfast, just the same, Beth and Fairy Tim put their heads together, for they did not mean that Robin should go without some surprises and birthdayishness on his birthday, if they could help it. Beth was standing by the gate post, and Fairy Tim was sitting on the gate post, and so you see, their heads were really and truly together, and you shall hear what came of it. It was while Beth and Fairy Tim were scheming surprises for Robin that Dick Barnes came to the parsonage on an errand for his mother. He had remembered about Robin's birthday too. The Denning children's birthday parties were always great fun, even if they were littler children. He hoped very much that he would be asked to this one, in spite of all the mischievous tricks he had been playing lately. Perhaps that is why, when he came to Beth standing by the gate post. He took a big red apple out of his pocket and gave it to her. Beth was surprised, but pleased. Dick said, "Day after tomorrow is Robin's birthday, isn't it?" Beth stopped, after the first big bite out of her unexpected apple, to answer, "Yes, but there's not to be a party this year. Marlene must do us instead. Mother just said so." Poor Dick. And he had given away his apple. "I'll just get even for that," he promised himself as he went on his errand. He had gone away too quickly for Beth to have a chance to offer him the clear juice. In any case, some other time would be better, she thought, when he had not that cross expression on his face. A little disappointed, she started off with Fairy Tim to Flora's house. If anyone could help with their wonderful plan, it was Flora. They found her alone, and just finishing drying the breakfast dishes. An apron, all pink and white checks, was tied around her neck. It was so big. Flora was glad to see Beth and Fairy Tim so early in the morning. "You see," Beth explained, rather breathlessly, after she had told why there was to be no party. "Fairy Tim and I happened to think of something that won't cost any money at all, and we think Robin will like it almost best of anything in the world. Only, of course, we need your help." "But what is it?" asked Flora. She was as eager as Beth. "A tree house. A real tree house, right up in a tree that will be his very, very own." Flora clapped her hands. What child wouldn't like that? But then she cried, "Oh, if Mother were only here! She's sewing for Miss Saltus today a party dress for the princess. She would know how we ought to go about it. But now, since she isn't here, we'll just have to go ahead alone." Flora's dishes were all dried now and put away. Beth helped her with the beds and the dusting up. Working together so, it took only a very few minutes. Then they were ready. They decided to build the surprise house in the big white pine out in the meadows, not far from the parsonage. A grove of birches hid it from the parsonage windows, so that was all right. Robin, unless he should happen to come right out there, would never discover what they were doing. Fairy Tim agreed to attend to that end of it and keep Robin busy elsewhere. Away ran the two girls toward the meadows, and away ran Fairy Tim to find Robin. But it is not the easiest thing in the world for two little girls, all alone, to build a house high in a white pine, a house that is strong enough for a little boy to sit in and play in, and that is worth calling his own. However, they tried very, very hard, and worked until they were hot and weary. They used a pile of brush that lay handily near. They tried building the house as birds build their nest, by weaving and bracing the branches into a big fork of the tree. They had climbed up and down the stair-like branches of the white pine dozens of times, But the house had scarcely grown at all when Dick came whistling through the pasture. He was making a shortcut to a new secret meeting place of the Big Six, and was a little late, for his mother had kept him running errands all the morning. But even so, when he caught sight of the girls and what they were doing up in the old white pine, he came nearer to watch. The Big Six would have to wait. Here was something interesting. "What are you doing up there?" he called out at last, for he was much puzzled. Beth answered in a friendly spirit, remembering the apple. "It's to be a tree house for Robin. A surprise, because he can't have a party." Dick whistled and waited on, watching. "What a splendid place it is for a tree house," he said to himself. "But how awkward and stupid about it those little girls are. They never can get it strong enough with just old brush. They ought to see that. It needs hammer and nails, and some real lumber. Yes, and some fellows like myself to build it, big boys. How mussed and tired those little girls look." It was true. Beth's usually smooth hair was rumpled and tangled with sticks and pine needles, and her flushed cheeks were streaked with pitch. Flora's dress was torn in several places, and her bare legs were scratched. "Say, up there," Dick called at last. "Wait a bit, girls, and I'll get help. We'll have great fun building that house. It's a fine place for it, and I know where I can get some lumber. Father said just yesterday I might have it." How delighted and relieved, too, the little girls were. Truly the task had begun to seem too big for them. Dick ran away to the meeting place of his followers. It was not long before he came back, hurrying across the meadows, followed by the Big Six. Dick was waving a saw, and the little girls, even from their high place in the arms of the tree, could see that his pockets were bulging with nails. The other boys were carrying on their shoulders a pile of the lumber that Dick's father had given him. They were all full of interest and eagerness, for it is great fun to build a house in a tree. Everyone knows that. The little girls clapped their hands. "Now we'll show you," Dick promised them proudly. "Now we'll show you how to build a tree house, as it should be built. You've picked just the right fork for it, though. Couldn't be better. Now all to work." And the Big Six fell to, whistling, and Gay Dick, for the while, had forgotten all about getting even. And as for the others of the Big Six, they had never had more fun in their lives. They were too busy to think of mischief. But Beth, watching and grateful, still thought to herself sensibly, "No, even now is not the right time to give him the clear juice. He wouldn't bother to stop." She felt in her pocket to make sure that the precious thimble was safe after all that tree climbing. "I'm glad I had the patience to carry it all the way down through the meadow without spilling," she told herself, "and I'll remember to give it to him when the right time comes." Chapter 15. In the Treehouse. When Robin woke on his birthday morning, he at once remembered that this was not to be like other birthdays. There would be no presents, and worst of all, no party. What a bother it was being poor. But you will remember that Robin was a thoughtful little boy, and so he did not stop his thinking with, "What a bother it is being poor." No, he went on with it to the place where it came to him that it was a bother to his mother as well as to himself. She wanted him to have a party, and a happy birthday, of course. And then, although he had turned 7 only a few minutes ago, he said out loud, "I'm not going to let her know I care a bit." "Good for you," cried a muffled little voice from under his pillow. Robin rolled over, stuck in his hand, and pulled out Fairy Tim. He held him up, shaking him a little, but somehow the daylight cape slipped through his fingers, and Fairy Tim, in a flash, was on the foot rail of the bed. "What were you doing under my pillow?" asked Robin. "Well, a fellow like you only has a birthday once a year," laughed Fairy Tim. "I was bound to be the first to wish you a happy one, that's all." "Thank you much for that," said Robin, gratefully, and from that minute he found, to his own surprise, that it was not at all hard pretending to like a birthday without a party in it. After all, it isn't every boy in the country who can pull a fairy from under his pillow on his birthday morning. Beth, of course, was almost bursting with her secret, but she had to keep from bursting somehow, for the Big Six and the fairy seers, putting all their heads together for once, had decided that 3 o'clock in the afternoon was the hour to show Robin his tree house. It could not be sooner, because this was Saturday, and most of the children had to help their fathers and mothers in the house or yard in preparation for Sunday. How Beth got through all the hours until 3, I cannot say, but of course she had Fairy Tim to help her. At last the hour came, though, as even the greatest hours do, and Beth strolled into the study where Robin was busy drawing a map at his father's desk. "Let's go find some bluebells in the meadow, Robin," she said, as calmly as she could. "Oh, wait a while. I've almost finished this map. You go along, and I'll find you by and by." Beth was in dismay, but Fairy Tim saved the day. He whispered to Robin. Now when a fairy whispers, you hear it with your heart and not your ear. And the heart understands something different from words. So I cannot tell you what Fairy Tim whispered. Neither could Robin, for that matter. He only knew suddenly that it seemed best for him to put the map away, take Beth's hand, and run with her out into the meadow. But instead of going to the brook, where the most bluebells were, Beth pulled her brother, almost running, over toward the white pine. When they came to a standstill under it, Robin looked at her in surprise. "What's the matter with you, Beth?" he asked. "You look and act so queer. But just at that instant, out from a patch of blueberry bushes, near jumped the fairy seers, and the big six, and the princess, with a big whoop. Now, when Robin saw the big six jumping out at him like that, he at once was ready for trouble, and although he was only just turned 7, and Beth had long been 8, he stood in front of her and clenched his hands. His eyes were flashing. "You just dare," he shouted. "You just dare." How all the children laughed, the fairy seers too. Only Dick did not laugh. He looked at the little boy with admiration. "Happy birthday, Robin Dinning," he said, and Robin could not help but see he meant it. Then all the others called, "Happy birthday, Robin," and Beth danced round and round, clapping her hands with delight. "Look up in the tree, look up in the tree, look up in the tree," she cried. "There is a surprise for you." Then Robin looked up for the first time and saw the tree house. It was a wonderful tree house, truly, the best that had ever been made in that village. The big six had outdone themselves. Why, it was so real a house. There was a window in it, and a door, and a piazza. Robin knew nothing to do but to gaze, wide-eyed, and say, "Oh," and "Oh," and "Oh," under his breath. And up there, in the doorway, stood Fairy Tim beckoning him up, and laughing. Go up and see it," all the children shouted. It was hard for Robin to believe that the wonderful house was to be his. For as long as he could remember, he had wanted a place that was all his own, a place to keep his treasures in, and a place to think his thoughts. You know Robin had many thoughts, but he never could have it, not even a corner, for the parsonage was much too small. And now here it was at last, and it was a house away off by itself, up among the branches of a big tree, halfway between the earth and sky. Happy, happy Robin! But when Robin had climbed up and gone in at the painted green door, there was another surprise. In the middle of the floor, a lacy tray cloth was spread, and right in the middle of that, on a big plate, stood a beautiful birthday cake. It was covered with thick icing, and wreathed with flowers, all made of colored candies, and up out of pink candy roses grew 7 lighted candles. 7 candles for Robin's 7 years. Nearby, on a silver tray, were 15 tall glasses of lemonade, with a cherry floating on the top of every one. Beth had been the first to follow Robin up into the tree house, and now she stood as amazed as he. Who had made it a party? Not she or any of the other children. They had just made the house. How had the party come here? "Come up, oh, come quick, quick," she cried, down to them. And up they all came, scrambling. I think the old tree must have felt strangely gay and glad. How the fairy seer's eyes widened, and how the eyes of the big six widened, and how the princess's eyes widened when they saw the cake and the lemonade, how they turned to one another in delighted wonder. It just must be Fairy Tim's doing, Lucy breathed at last. Fairy Tim, and Miss Angela, and Miss Saltus, and my mother. Flora cried then, for Flora was a reader of fairy minds. Remember, and she had suddenly read all these names, just as easily as could be from looking at Fairy Tim. Yes, those are our goblets, the princess owned in a surprised voice. How did they ever get here? And that's Miss Angela's silver tray, agreed Dick. Well, Dick remembered that silver tray's appearance at the party. He had not been invited to in Miss Angela's garden that time in the moonlight. But how did Miss Saltus and Miss Angela know, wondered Beth, and whoever of grown-ups could climb up here into the tree with all these things? Fairy Tim must have told them, said Flora, reading Fairy Tim's mind again. And my mother did all the climbing. My mother is different from most grown-ups. She is so young and so merry. Yes, everyone there knew that Flora's mother was a wonderful person. But 'twas Fairy Tim that told. Robin remembered his fairy friend. And he's here, and we can thank him. And Dick, speaking in rather an odd way for the others of the Big Six, said, "Your Fairy Tim must be a fellow worth knowing. Won't you introduce us to him?" Beth held up her hand to Dick, with Fairy Tim dancing on the palm of it. Dick looked hard. He grew puzzled and almost troubled for an instant, for he had seen something like a golden light hovering over Beth's palm, but then he blinked and saw no more. Of course, all the 15 children could not get into the tree house. There was not near enough room. So some sat in the branches near the door, and some on the piazza, and even some on the roof, while Flora and Beth cut the cake, and Billy Sullivan and Robin passed the lemonade. But Beth, in spite of her busyness with the cake, realized her opportunity. "Wait a minute, Robin," she whispered. "Is that Dick's glass?" Quickly, out of her pocket, she pulled the thimble. Robin at once understood what she was about. "Here's my penknife to break the paraffin," he whispered. And so it was that when Dick took his first sip of lemonade, he opened his eyes, a little in surprise. Sort of queer tasting for just lemonade. It had, you see, a burning, chilling, bitter-sweet taste on his tongue. The fairy drink. Beth watched him eagerly. Robin watched him too. He tipped back his head and drank some more, a long drink. But if his eyes had widened at the first sip, now they were opened wide indeed. Dick's big brown eyes had grown velvet black with surprise, for there, on the opposite rim of his glass, Fairy Tim was perched, laughing at him across the red cherry. Dick almost dropped the glass, but he did not drop it quite, for he was a clever boy, one well worthy of a fairy's confidence, really. Instead, he gripped the stem more firmly and called out to everyone, "Let's drink to Fairy Tim." And so he drained the goblet, looking straight across all the time into Fairy Tim's eyes. How surprised the Big Six were to see their leader drinking so lustily to Fairy Tim, I cannot tell you. But they did not protest with him, for after all, this was Robin's birthday party. It was only kind to humor the littler children. But Beth softly clapped her hands and danced a little on her toes, and Dick, catching her at it, suddenly became embarrassed and looked away. But as he looked away, he tossed his head as much as to say, "Well, what of it if I have seen Fairy Tim, and know he's not just pretend? I don't see why I can't see a fairy as well as you, even if I am a big boy and president of the Big Six." He did not say all this, you know. He just tossed his head, as much as to say it, and Beth only smiled to herself for answer, a soft, satisfied smile. When the last crumb of the cake was gone, and the last drop of lemonade, Beth sensibly said, "Now we'd better take the goblets back to Miss Saltus, and the silver tray to Miss Angela, and thank them for the surprise, and then let's go out to Flora's house and thank her mother." Everyone agreed. And what fun it would be thanking Flora's mother. The Big Six thought her as wonderful as the fairy seers did. But after they had all gone away, down the stair-like limbs of the white pine, and off across the meadows, bearing the goblets, and the tray, and the candles, Robin stayed behind in his tree house alone for a few minutes. "I love you, little house," he said softly, looking all about him with happy eyes with a birthday shining in them. Then he too scrambled down the tree stairs, and taking a short-cut, beat them all to Miss Angela's house with his thank you. Chapter 19. He Will Surely Come Again. One Sunday afternoon, Beth and Robin and baby Paul were lying in a circle out on the lawn, their chins in their palms, facing one another. Not far from them, little Marlene was having her nap in her outdoor sleeping basket. That is why the children were speaking in low voices. But Fairy Tim did not lower his voice, for there was no danger of his waking the baby. Never a fairy's voice woke a baby yet, not unless the baby needed waking to be fed, or for some other good purpose. Fairy Tim was sitting in the circle the children made, leaning back against baby Paul's shoulder. He, as well as the children, was resting from play. Robin was saying, "What shall we do now? It's so hard to find games that Mother and Father think are all right for Sunday. Tell us, Fairy Tim, what shall we do now?" But Fairy Tim surprised them. "Think up something for yourselves," he said. "I can't play any more anyway." "Why, Fairy Tim?" Beth cried, almost forgetting to speak softly. "Why must we think up games for ourselves, with you right here? And why can't you play any more? Do you want to do something else?" "It's this way," explained Fairy Tim. "If I go on forever making up games for you to play, why, you'll become quite helpless yourselves. You'll be as bad as city children who have to be taught how to play and keep at it all the time. You wouldn't like to be like city children, would you?" Now Beth and Robin, in their hearts, had always thought it would be rather wonderful to be city children. Think of living in an apartment right up against the sky, 12 stories high. they had a cousin who lived in such a place. Baby Paul had never bothered to think anything about it at all, but now all three children, because they trusted Fairy Tim's wisdom, shook their heads, as much as to say they certainly didn't want to be like city children. And Fairy Tim went on then, "Besides, here is my last chance to get back to Fairyland this season." He pointed to a yellow buttercup growing right under Beth's nose. She had not noticed it before, in spite of its being so close. She reached a hand to pick it, but Fairy Tim sprang upon her hand before it reached the buttercup. "Please, please, what are you doing, Beth Denning?" he cried. The children were surprised at his excitement, but Beth drew back her hand. "How would I ever get back home again this year if you picked that buttercup?" Fairy Tim demanded. "It's the very last buttercup anywhere around. I've been watching it, and knowing I'd have to use it for a door unless I meant to stay on with you until next buttercup time." But the children were aghast. "Why, Fairy Tim, you're not going to leave us," they begged. "We could never do without you, Fairy Tim. We just wouldn't know what to do without you." "Ho, ho," said Fairy Tim, laughing at them, but comradely. "Now you have come to one of the very most tremendous fairy lessons of all. It is this. Listen." He ran round and round in a circle under their faces, dancing and somersaulting. Fairies always dance and turn somersaults when they are thinking very hard. He came to a standstill at last and said, "Fairy Truth, number 999, but there he stopped and began dancing and somersaulting some more. But for all his dancing and all his somersaulting, he could not seem to think of fairy words simple enough for this most tremendous of fairy truths that he wanted to tell them. At last he gave it up. "You'll just have to find it out for yourselves," he said at last. "But I'll tell you this. It's silly to say you can't do without me. We've become far too good friends for that." Now Robin understood what Fairy Tim meant by this. Yes, indeed. Well, he knew that Fairy Tim and he were such good friends that he could very well do without him. But Beth puzzled over it without coming to any understanding. That is, with her head. Her heart knew about it, as well as Robin's, of course. "But who's to be our president if you go?" she asked now, trying to wheedle him. "I'll let you be acting president," Fairy Tim said quickly. "Acting president? Oh, goody. That means you'll be coming back sometime." The children's faces were sparkling with relief. "Why, of course, I'll be coming back sometime," agreed Fairy Tim. "Oh, but I had forgotten. That's another fairy truth you haven't learned yet. We hadn't come to it. It's easier to put than the 999th one, too. All that goes comes again." The children were satisfied, but Fairy Tim went on. "All that goes doesn't always come again in just the same way, though. Sometimes it seems quite another thing altogether." "Oh dear, do you mean we shan't know it's you when you come?" "Yes, you'll know me, for I shall still be Fairy Tim. because I mean to come quite soon, before there's been much time for change. But I can't come through a buttercup. It will have to be through something else, unless I'm to wait until next May, which I don't mean to. Well, what will you come through? Tell us, so we can be watching, please. I don't know yet, but it will be through a flower, or a grass, or a leaf, or a sunbeam, or a barn fire, or a smile, or something like that. Only you must keep your eyes wide open all the time, if I am to manage it. For unless you see me standing in the door of the sunbeam, or whatever it is I am trying to come through, waving my tam-o'-shanter at you, of course I can't get out. It's you who have to let me out, you know. Yes, we know, said Robin, and we'll watch for you, waving your tam. Yes, do. And now, goodbye. Fairy Tim was standing right in front of the Buttercup door. But you'll come again. You've promised. Beth and Robin and baby Paul besought him. Fairy Tim, for answer, leaned back against the Buttercup and sang them his answer in his high, thin, fairy voice. Little Marlene, because it was bottle time now, opened wide her dark blue eyes and heard it too. Every learned fairy knows, when an honest comrade goes, you can't say how, you can't say when, he surely will come back again. With the last word of his song, Fairy Tim turned about and ran away through the Buttercup door. Then where was the Buttercup, and where was Fairy Tim? Fairy Tim, I can tell you surely, was away, skipping and leaping over the fields of his own land, making great speed toward home, and the Buttercup, I think, but of this I am not sure, had heard all the talk about its being the last one, and suddenly, being made to feel lonely, had stolen away to Buttercup Land. That night, at the supper table, Miss Denning said surprisedly, "Why, Robin, what is the matter? You have been such a good boy about drinking your milk for weeks past, and now you've hardly touched it." "I hate milk," Robin answered rather crossly. "It was Fairy Tim who drank it for me. You said he might." Mother Denning looked troubled and puzzled as well. She had forgotten all about that arrangement, and of course, since she had never once seen Fairy Tim, there was no reason why she should have kept it in mind. "You'd better manage to drink it somehow, Robin," sensible Beth whispered into her brother's ear. "Or perhaps when Fairy Tim comes back, Mother won't be pouring you out any at all. Then what would Fairy Tim do?" So Robin tried, for his fairy friend's sake, and to his surprise, he found that he did not mind his milk so much after all. It was so warm and sweet. But that evening, the parsonage children were quieter than usual, and when they had at last been sent to bed, Mother Denning turned to Father Denning and said, "What ails them, I wonder? They are acting so queerly." Father Denning could not tell her what ailed them, though he had noticed it too. He sat without reading for a while, worrying because his children had seemed saddened. But after a time, when Beth and Robin and baby Paul were all in their nightgowns and out on the sleeping porch, this song came floating down and in at the sitting-room window, where the minister and his wife were sitting. Every learned fairy knows, when an honest comrade goes, you can't say how, you can't say when, he surely will come back again. Father Denning went on with his reading, well contented, and Mother Denning took up her sewing, for the singing voices had sounded light and gay, as though the Denning children were their happy selves again. And baby Marlene, away in Mother's room, stretched up her little arms above her head and smiled without waking up. The song had reached her in dreamland, where she played and made her glad. Where do you suppose they all get their rhymes and airs from? Asked Mother Denning, as she threaded a needle. From the fairies themselves, I shouldn't wonder, murmured Father Denning, but there was a twinkle in his eye